Hi, everybody. We're glad you're here. Thank you for stopping by. It's a pleasure to sit down with you, as always, with these podcasts. Now, the whole purpose of these podcasts is to let you have the opportunity to hear from the movers and shakers of the real estate appraisal industry. That's why we're here. And today, we've got one of them. We've got an attorney, KOLBY REDDISH. KOLBY's out of Boise, Idaho. He works with the State Department of Revenue. He works with appraisers. He knows what it is we do. So he is going to bring an insight to us today on critical thinking and logical fallacies. And as KOLBY makes his presentation, you're going to understand why critical thinking and understanding logical fallacies and what they are and how they can hurt come into play in, for example, expert witness testimony. And let's face it, a lot of appraisers right now are moving out of GSE work and they're moving into expert witness work. So this is going to be a mover and shaker you want to pay attention to. So KOLBY, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. How are you?
Well, Tim, thanks for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and I'm doing well today. Yeah, like you said, if I could just briefly kind of introduce myself. So I'm KOLBY REDDISH. I'm an attorney. I work in private practice with a firm called Smith and Malik in Boise, Idaho. And I would just one little correction. I used to work with the State Department of Revenue. I mean, I still do have friends there and talk to them regularly, understand kind of, the appraisal world. At a high level as much as an attorney has to, right? So I definitely have done some introductory appraisal courses and done that type of valuation litigation in the past. Today, though, I mostly specialize in appellate matters. For example, last month I was arguing a case in front of the Idaho Supreme Court about a big constitutional question. So I kind of specialize in those appellate matters, state and local government type questions. But I do have that history, like you said, in doing some high appraisal or high impact appraisal valuation cases, specifically unitary appraisal. So I'm glad to be here. I think it's a wonderful podcast that you've set up that serves as a resource for appraisers because I always found the work that I did with appraisers really interesting. Like you have this, this confluence of legal authorities, and then you also have appraisal practice kind of overlaid on top. And I always found those types of cases really interesting. And like you said, critical thinking and logical fallacies is what we'll talk about today and talk about really why those things are important because, appraisers, especially if they're going to be acting as an expert witness, what they're really doing is they're putting their opinion out there. And so critical thinking and understanding logical fallacies and why logical fallacies are a problem are really essential in having a good, well-grounded opinion. So just to kind of give us a brief little roadmap of what we'll talk about today, we'll talk, in depth a little bit about why epistemology or the study of how we know things matters. And then we'll talk about some examples of logical fallacies and talk about really why logical fallacies are a problem in any type of opinion. So starting with, what is epistemology? So epistemology is defined as the theory of knowledge, especially with regards to its methods, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from a simple opinion. And I have this quote from science educator Carl Sagan. This is actually from his daughter Sasha Sagan's book. It's just a quote that I really like. My wife and I have a framed version of this that's all prettied up on the mantle just because we really like this message. It's that it is dangerous to believe things just because you want them to be true. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting about studying and working through epistemology is that epistemology can teach us how to avoid believing things, even things that are true, for bad reasons. The longest standing definition of knowledge dates back to, clear to ancient Greek philosophy as something that is a justified true belief. And that means that believing something that is consistent with reality for good reasons. That's what I would call a justified true belief. Now, when I say good reasons, I'm not necessarily commenting on the quality of a piece of evidence or on the quality of an opinion. I'm actually taking a much more basic level of what that means. And what I mean is, in this context, when I say good reasons, I mean that the reason is not a logical fallacy. It doesn't have a fallacy embedded in it. And we'll cover those fallacies in detail in a little bit more time today. But logical fallacies are a problem because if people aren't aware, a logical fallacy by definition is something that cannot prove an argument true. And so what that means is that if an argument is only supported by logical fallacies, we really don't have a good reason to believe in that thing, because fallacies, by their definition, can't lead us to a true conclusion. So in other words, when I say, we want to talk about why we have beliefs for good reasons or for good reasoning, solid rational reasoning, that's really what we're talking about, is something that is non-fallacious, that it's not supported by a fallacy. So going kind of to our overview of why does epistemology matter, in my view, and this doesn't just apply to real estate appraisal or to any specific thing, it applies to everything. Before we can decide on any course of action that we're going to take or how to solve a problem, we have to first agree on what the problem is. And because epistemology is really the study of how you know what you know, it's one of the most important things that we can teach people and study and help work through our own cognitive biases. One of the things I think that's really come to light in the last 20 years of research of human psychology and organizational psychology is we have a better understanding of our brains and the fact that our brains are meaning-finding machines by design, that that's what they do. And so they will find a lot of times even bad reasons for us to believe things. And so to me, epistemology is one of the most important lessons we can learn to try and do the very best we can to make sure that we're not falling prey to those cognitive biases. In fact, I've said before that if there was one lesson I would hope that we can teach every kid in the American school system, and ideally while they're still young, it's the basics of epistemology. It's understanding why logical fallacies are a problem in having discussions about trying to determine what is and isn't true. And that's because this study of epistemology is the method that we use to decide on what reality is. And so we really can't solve any problem until we know what that problem actually is and the extent of it. Now here I have a quote from the advisory committee notes from Federal Rule of Evidence 702. And for those who haven't worked as an expert witness in the past, I think it's important to note that Rule of Evidence 702 is what governs the admissibility of expert testimony. So this is talking specifically about those in your audience that are either interested in having a better grounding for their opinions or interested in working as an expert witness at some point in their career. The advisory committee notes are the people who drafted the rule that ended up and still governs expert witness testimony today. And the idea behind the rule they give here is that an intelligent evaluation of facts is often difficult or impossible without the application of some scientific, technical, or other specialized knowledge. The most common source of this knowledge is the expert witness, although there are other techniques for supplying that. And so I've underlined that, that phrase there, an intelligent evaluation of facts, because that's ultimately what we're going for. And that's why I think understanding the basics of epistemology and why logical fallacies are a problem is important for people who are thinking about, entering this arena as expert witnesses. And aside from just applying to the expert witnesses themselves, one of the things I wanted to note is that, these principles that we learn about solid epistemology and avoiding logical fallacies, it doesn't just apply to expert witnesses. So here in the jurisdiction in which I practice, which is Idaho, judicial decisions themselves can actually be reversed by appellate courts, the higher courts that review lower court decisions, because they have not been reached by an exercise of reason. And so I wanted to quickly kind of talk about the facts of this Idaho Supreme Court case, State v. Levesque from 2018. Now, as I introduce the underlying facts of this case, I think it can help highlight how easy it can be to lose sight of reason. And what I mean is we were just talking about cognitive biases and the traps that our minds can fall in if we're not careful and if we don't understand the way that our brains can work. And this case highlights that perfectly. So what happened in this case is it was a criminal case, and the defendant in this case was on probation. And the district judge, whose decision was being reviewed on appeal, had revoked this individual's probation, which means just he had sent him back to prison, basically. Now, the problem in the case was that the district court had found that he was sending the probationer back to prison because he had failed to obey a court order from the judge to do certain things. That's what the judge had said, and that was the reason that he had sent him back to prison. The problem was that on appeal, review of the record showed that the judge had never actually ordered the defendant to do those things, and that he was punishing him for by sending him back to prison. And so the Idaho Supreme Court reversed, finding that this decision was not reached through an exercise of reason. And so I've highlighted that part of the test that the court reviewed it under. Whoops, excuse me. And then I thought this passage was really interesting. The Idaho Supreme Court wrote that the role of this court in determining if the district court reached its decision by an exercise of reason is to review the process the district court engaged in to make its decision. The hallmark of a discretionary decision that is not reached by an exercise of reason is arbitrariness. And so one of the ways I think about this is that this just helps highlight that even for judges, how important it is to understand critical thinking and avoiding logical fallacies and the related problems. I like to think of it, when it talks there about reviewing the process that the district court engaged in to make its decision, I like to think of that almost like elementary school math again, right? You go back to grade school math, and the whole idea is you have to show your work, right? And those who've worked in the appraisal field know that that's a big component of your work as well, right? Is explaining and being able to give rational reasons for the assumptions and the justifications that you put into ultimately your opinion on valuation. Any thoughts on that, Tim? Does that surprise you that a judge can have his decision reviewed for not reaching it by an exercise of reason?
Well, the obviously, because of the checks and balances in the judicial system, there has to be a higher review. And it's a shame that that it can be so time consuming and expensive to appeal decisions. But yeah, there's got to be somebody higher up who is not emotionally involved and can take a look at it and say, no, you kind of missed this one. And so here, I'm giving it back to you. Why don't you think about it and make another decision, which is basically the polite way of saying, you screwed up, dude. Try it again.
It is exactly the way that they say that. That's spot on. And as much as, we could dress it up in the legal jargon, and maybe I got a little too technical in describing it, but I love the way you restated it, because really it is as simple as the Supreme Court telling this judge, you didn't have a good reason for what you did. And that's really, when we go back to those foundations of epistemology we covered in the last couple slides, that's really all we're asking, is developing a solid epistemology is learning how to develop good reasons for the things that we think and do. So let's talk about what's that?
I'm sorry, which is extremely real estate appraisal.
Absolutely.
Because again, it's an opinion. Yeah, it's worth $350,000, but then somebody has the right and indeed the responsibility to go, oh, okay, why? And
right.
We have to be able to explain.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about logical fallacies before we get into some examples. And what I mean is, let's talk about them generally. So there are two types of logical fallacies. There are formal logical fallacies and informal logical fallacies. Now, we won't really cover formal logical fallacies in depth here, particularly because formal logical fallacies really have to do with the structure of an argument. So to really, delve into formal logical fallacies, one of the things that we need to do is talk about syllogistic logic. And by syllogistic logic, what I mean is, you might remember things from like a general philosophy class or even a general history class or science class that you might have taken in high school. Things like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's what's called a syllogism, a logical syllogism. And they are, what they include is they include premises and then a conclusion. The reason we won't delve too deep into formal logical fallacies is because they're really just have to do with how you set up the equation of a syllogism and if you set them up incorrectly. But the ones that we see much more common, whether it's in political discourse, online discourse, as we've talked about, opinions of experts sometimes, are informal logical fallacies, or the reasoning that's right next to an informal logical fallacy. And in fact, you'd be surprised as you work to understand logical fallacies, just how common we see them all over the place in these types of discussions. And so to come back to something I said a few minutes ago, the point of understanding these different logical fallacies is to understand that those fallacies by definition cannot lead you to a true conclusion. So By that, what I mean is if what we want to know is whether something is true or not, then we really just need to avoid logical fallacies at all. Even if it's things that we believe for other good reasons, logical fallacies just really aren't that useful. And so understanding what they are can help us avoid falling into those traps. So let's talk about some of the examples. Here's one of the most common ones is an ad hominem logical fallacy. And what an ad hominem logical fallacy is it is an attack, again, on the claims of the person based on who that person themselves is. So I think the area where we see this one almost constantly is in political discourse, particularly between different sides. And I'm not taking one side or the other. I'm just saying it's very common for people to snipe at each other in political discourse in an ad hominem way. Ad hominem is Latin for attacks the man or attacks the person. And so that's exactly what you look for in an ad hominem attack, is basically someone just telling you that that person's contentions or that their propositions cannot be true because of who they are. And if we think about it for a second, we know that that can't be the case, right? The fact that a bad person or someone that you don't like or someone that you don't agree with says something doesn't automatically make it false. And that's why it's fallacious reasoning. Very similar to this is the next example that I wanted to talk about, which is the straw man. And this is one that you see very common also in this type of discourse. What it is it's misstating an opponent's viewpoint and then attacks that hollow argument. So that's why it's called a straw man, right? We're constructing this straw man that then we attack and knock down easily, making it look like we've knocked down the other side of the disagreement's arguments, when in reality, we've knocked down an easier to defeat fake version of their argument. So the opposite of straw man is what we call steel manning someone's position, which is presenting or countering the best version of their argument. And that's something that comes to a head and really is where the rubber meets the road for those who've testified in court. Anytime you're going to testify in court, you're going to be subject to cross-examination. And so that's where, you may feel like you're having your position or your opinion misstated, and that would be a form of fallacious reasoning. And one of the reasons that we try and correct that through rehabilitation with your own attorney or your own side's attorney. Our next example is the red herring fallacy. So it's so named because a red herring was a type of fish that they would drag across the path of, bloodhounds or hunting dogs that diverted those hunting dogs from finding the prey or the target. And so by definition, the red herring fallacy is a diversionary tactic that avoids the key issues, often by avoiding opposing arguments rather than by addressing them. So a real common, we've actually seen a huge rise of the use of red herring fallacies in online discussions and in political discussions, again, over the last couple of years. And the reason is one of the other names that the red herring can go by is the idea of whataboutism, which means that, say Tim and I are having an argument about one topic, and then I bring up something completely unrelated to try and draw Tim's attention away from the disagreement that we were already in the middle of having and trying to figure out. That's what's known as a red herring, or can be known as whataboutism. And the last one we'll cover on this slide is the bandwagon appeal. This is an appeal that presents what most people think or what a group of people think in order to persuade someone to think the same way. And really what this is premised off of is the idea that because an idea is popular or because it's lasted for a long time, that it must be true. And when we're talking about the actual truth of something, in fact, if we think about it, and that's one of the reasons I love talking about these logical fallacies, is with every single one of them, if we pause and think for a moment, we can see that it has nothing to do with the actual underlying truth proposition. So the fact that, say before the model of the solar system that we have today, that is solar centric, we had the geocentric model, dating back the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe. Everyone at one time on the Earth believed that. It doesn't mean that it was true, right? Today we know that it wasn't true. And so the bandwagon fallacy or the bandwagon appeal fallacy is just that idea, the idea that just because something is believed by a lot of people, that it must be true. Any thoughts on these fallacies before we move to the next slide, Tim? Have you seen these used in your work in appraisal?
Yeah, Colby, I was going to ask you, where does the issue of begging the question come in?
Oh, perfect. It comes in a few slides.
Oh, okay, good. Well, then great. We'll wait for those slides then. Okay.
Great. I'll move on to the next slide. So I've got 12 fallacies that we'll go through all together. So let's cover these ones. The next is the false cause logical fallacy. And what this is you might have heard before someone say something like, you're confusing correlation for causation. That's the false cause logical fallacy. It's presuming a relationship between two things means that one is the cause of the other. And the perfect example I can think of for this one, and there's also a fancy Latin phrase that goes with this one. It's the idea of post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means because that, or I'm sorry, it means after this, then because of this. And here's a simple way to see how problematic this reasoning can be, right? So let's say every morning, and this is true, by the way, every morning, I live a little bit out in the country outside of Boise. Every morning I wake up, I hear my one of my neighbor's roosters crow, okay? And also every morning when I wake up, my lawn is wet. The idea here, the false cause relationship that I could find is that my lawn is wet every morning because the rooster crows. It's the idea that just because I've noticed a relationship between two things, that the one is causing the other, when in reality, it can be the other way around. We can have a third cause, or they can be completely, unrelated as far as causation goes. It can just be a simple correlation. Just like in this example here, the rooster crows every morning, and my lawn is wet every morning because of either the condensation on the ground or because of my sprinklers, right? That's just the way that it works. The composition fallacy is the fallacy where one assumes that one example of something completely defines the whole. So, a real simple way to state this is people have probably heard it before. One bad apple can't spoil the whole bunch, or you might have heard one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch. In reality, both of those ideas are a fallacy in the sense that the composition fallacy just means that we can't take one specific example and necessarily extrapolate that to the whole. Whether it's a good example, a bad example, that's just how composition works. We just have to be very careful about the assumption that we're applying and how far we're willing to extrapolate based on one single example. The appeal to consequences logical fallacy is the idea that something should be believed to be true or not true based on the desirability or the undesirability of the consequences. So I'm trying to think of a great example with this one is there's this great movie on Netflix. It's like a pseudo comedy satire called Don't Look Up. It's about a massive asteroid headed for the Earth. It's got Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence in it, and it's really, really funny. And part of what happens in that movie, part of the plot of the movie, is that there are big interests, including the U.S. government, that don't want people to know or appreciate that there's a giant asteroid heading for the world that's going to destroy us. And the idea is that you see this fallacy constantly in the movie. It's the idea that because that idea is so scary and because it's so difficult to accept the reality that it was headed for the people in the movie, that they don't want to accept it, when the reality is that the consequences of an idea or how comfortable we are with the idea really has nothing to do with the underlying truth of the idea. And the last one on this slide is the idea of the no true Scotsman. The no true Scotsman is a fallacy where someone appeals to purity as a way to dismiss criticism or flaws of an argument. And the real famous example and where it draws its name from is, someone making the contention that, no Scotsman has sugar on his porridge. And then someone gives an example that contradicts that. They say like, well, there's Hamish and he puts sugar on his porridge and he's a Scotsman. And the person will say, well, then no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. The idea is they're discounting this. This is in a way related to the composition fallacy we talked about earlier. It's actually dismissing, one legitimate example that kind of breaks the argument by appealing to purity and saying like, well, no true Scotsman would do that. Moving to our next set,
I
we
always thought it
have
was
the.
true that no
Oh,
Scotsman
go
wore
ahead.
anything. I always thought it was true that no Scotsman ever wore anything under his kilt, but we won't go there.
That's right. And if you find one that isn't wearing a kilt, you can always just say, well, no true Scotsman would be found
No
not
true
wearing a
Scotland.
kilt, right?
Okay.
So you asked
Mhm.
earlier, Tim, about begging the question. So here's the begging the question fallacy, and we see this one constantly. Begging the question is a form of assuming the conclusion in the evidence. So one of the great examples is just using the argument to validate the argument. And one of the reasons that that's a huge problem is because it's not linked to anything other than its own argument. It's a circle. It's completely circular reasoning. It doesn't have any touch points outside of the argument. Um, I would say that one area I've seen this come up when I've worked with some appraisers in the past is if you have a specific appraisal methodology that, say you're working as a staff member and they have like an appraisal manual. If all you can do when you're asked, why did you do something this way, is say, because my manual told me so, that's an example of begging the question or assuming the conclusion. You're assuming the conclusion. You don't have any epistemic touch point outside of the argument or the conclusion. And so that's one of the reasons that that one is a problem. This one happens a lot. And it's important to note because begging the question happens a lot because it's an argument that is internally consistent. But if we can't point to something outside of something that's in the argument itself, then we don't have a good reason. Our next one is the false dilemma fallacy. False dilemmas happen when someone argues that there's only two alternatives or two options, when in fact there are more. And so that's why it's a fallacious argument. You see this a lot with people who have extreme black and white thinking, like they jump from one extreme to another. And so that's what's known as a false dilemma, because if we can show that there are more options than just holding to this position that there's only the two is a problem. And then last on this slide is the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is related to another fallacy called the natural fallacy. I kind of consider them one and the same. It's the idea that believing or not believing something, it's the idea of believing something or not believing it based purely on where it comes from. So there have been great examples of where, giant reporting groups like the New York Times have made mistakes. And so that's an example of why the genetic fallacy is important, why we should look for additional reasons to believe rather than just where something comes from. The related fallacy I mentioned, the naturalist fallacy, is the idea that just because something is the way it is, that's the way it should be. And then last but not least on logical fallacies, I wanted to cover this one because I think it's very important. This is the fallacy fallacy. So if we get in a discussion with someone and they're supporting their argument with fallacies or with a fallacy, it's a mistake to assume that someone is incorrect factually only because they're defending their argument using a fallacy. So that's why it's called the fallacy fallacy. True ideas can be supported by bad reasons. And that's why I like talking about logical fallacies, because rather than talk about fallacious reasoning and using these logical fallacies, we should be aware of them. We should head them off in our own thinking and when we're dealing with opinions and testimony, so that we have good reasons for the things that we believe. And to kind of close the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions from you, Tim. I have a quote from I think one of the most interesting philosophers that's written on critical thinking and epistemology, who's David Hume. He wrote once, "In our reasonings concerning matters of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance, from the highest certainty to the lowest species of moral evidence. A wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence." And so I really like that closing phrase there from Hume, because what it helps me to see is that we need to set aside logical fallacies if we want to make sure our opinions are grounded in something solid, in solid evidence, and that then we proportion that belief to the evidence.
Colby, can you go back 3 slides?
Yes. This one?
Yeah, composition, right. Okay.
Great.
Assuming that one example of something completely defines the whole. I'm going to make I'm going to hypothesize here and tell me if I'm just, totally out in left field. Appraisers have been criticized rather heavily and rather extensively over what some have described as bias. Yet the bias to which they point is most likely in appraisal, not in appraisers. So as a result, in painting appraisers with the retrograde brush of engaging in bias, when it really isn't, is that engaging in the fallacy of composition by trying to make one entire industry look, how shall we say, essentially useless?
Yeah, I think a perfect example of how what you're asking about, finding bias, could be used as a form of the composition fallacy is, let's say that I want to make the case that appraisers are biased. Generally, I find one appraiser that I can prove is biased in some way. What I would then do is use that one example to say, I found one biased appraiser, therefore all appraisers are biased. And that's where I think it becomes a problem. I think a really good check actually in appraisal practice, as far as the composition fallacy goes, is using like a sales comparison approach. You get these different comparables, not just one in many instances, right? And so that's a check that's built into appraisal methodology, as far as I understand it, that guards against the composition fallacy. In other words, I'd be committing, if I was an appraiser and I'm doing an appraisal, and I am wanting to steer clear of the composition fallacy, then I'm going to need, well, one, I'm going to need actual comparables, right? Which is always an interesting question. But then I'm going to need multiples of them. That can be really difficult when you're talking about, like unique properties, or, in the business valuation world, gigantic companies can be really difficult to value, particularly because they, giant rate regulated electric utilities don't sell every day. So you can't do a sales comparison approach, right? You've got to look to the different approaches to value. But that's kind of how I see the relationship between the two, or how bias could get to a composition fallacy place. Did I answer your question, Tim? Does that make sense?
Yes, Colby, thank you. Now let's go to begging the question.
Perfect.
Yeah, but okay, yeah. Slide 9, begging the question. All right. Assuming the conclusion in the evidence, and you mentioned the circularity of the reasoning. So it's very common to read in appraisal reports that the cost approach does not do a very good job in figuring out value, and therefore the appraiser omits the analytics via the cost. But yet, because the appraiser didn't do the cost approach, the appraiser doesn't know if it would be effective in coming up with a value conclusion. So that, to me, again, tell me if I'm off base, but to me, that looks like the appraiser is begging the question that the cost approach typically fails.
Right.
Whereas the appraiser can't know if it fails until the appraiser first does it and looks at it and goes, yep, that fails. Or, oh, no, hey, look, it worked. So, but that is that type of reasoning is indeed begging the question,
Yeah,
right?
no, I think that's absolutely right, Tim. And I think the reason it becomes begging the question is because logical fallacies, and the reason they're a problem, is they're the reasons we get to the conclusion. So particularly in the example you gave, which is that, the appraiser, let's say it's a newer appraiser, and they read in a manual or a textbook difficulties with the cost approach. And then they assume, based on that it's not necessary to do a cost approach. They're basically writing off the cost approach because of what they read in the book. That's where it becomes begging the question, is assuming that that's true just because you're reading it in a conclusory statement or in a conclusory text. That's where it becomes a problem. Now, if you had an appraiser that, feels like, based on their time in practice, for specific reasons that they can explain in detail, that a cost approach either wasn't feasible or didn't work for a particular property or didn't, accurately reflect value so that they weren't going to give it any weight as they're, doing any type of reconciliation. I think that's where it wouldn't be begging the question. It's a lot about the reason, not necessarily the conclusion. That's one of the interesting things to me about logical fallacies is that, and really is what we talked about with the fallacy, right? I can support true arguments with fallacies. The reason that we want to avoid fallacies even for true arguments is because the fallacious reason is not a good reason to believe. It's a reason that it's an argument that can be made that doesn't relate to the truth. And so that's where I think understanding these principles becomes real critical to avoid begging the question. It's all about, going back to our first slide on the definition of epistemology. It's, do I have a justified true belief, or do I have a justified belief in why I don't want to use the cost approach on this particular property? If you have a good reason beyond the book says so, or the book says that it's not, useful, then it's not begging the question. If you're only relying on that one conclusory statement, then it does become begging the question.
Okay. Let's and we're going to wrap this up pretty soon. Let's talk just a little bit about heuristics, which is basically a big, nasty, complicated way of saying rules of thumb.
Sure.
So what is wrong with saying, well, okay, 25 years ago, my first mentor told me that I always made the GLA adjustment at $38 a square foot. So I make it at $38 a square foot. I mean, it works. So why should I change? So we're again, sometimes you just gotta be like a police detective. You've got to assume an answer and see if the facts support it. So what's wrong with assuming $38 a square foot is the right GLA adjustment, as merely one example?
Yeah, and I think that's where I'd go back to our quote from David Hume, right? There's nothing wrong with having to start, and you're absolutely right. I understand heuristics the same way. Actually, as kind of like my side hobby and things that I do with my 10, almost 11-year-old, we play a lot of like strategy board games. That's like our big family hobby, okay? And we use heuristics all the time in that type of practice to say, like, well, that decision looks good, so I'm going to move forward with it. I think where it becomes a problem when we make those assumptions is where we don't go through and investigate the reasons for that assumption, or we don't test that assumption. We don't look at the evidence, like David Hume's talking about in this quote, and proportion our belief to that evidence. If all we have is that assumption based on what we were initially taught, if all we have is heuristics that aren't informed by our experience, aside from one little touch point, that's where I think it becomes a problem. But no, I love what you just said in the sense that we have to start from somewhere. And that's where I think we start with a hypothesis. It's a lot like the scientific method, right? Like we start with a hypothesis, or we start with wherever we want to start. But it's important then that we, going back to the court case we talked about, that we show the work, that we can show there are actually valid reasons behind the ultimate conclusions. But I don't think there's anything wrong with starting with a starting point that can sometimes be based on assumption. And if the assumption's proven true with legitimate pieces of evidence as we move forward, well, then it's no longer an assumption, right? It might have started that way. But that's the way I look at that, is we do need heuristics because we have to make decisions in our life. We can't hyperanalyze every single little assumption of, what's going to go into a cost table like that. Not all of the time on every single initial decision. But I think it's where, especially if we're, prepping an expert witness report, or we're prepping something that's going to be final, that's where I think we do need to self-police, and we need to go back and check and say, do I have good reasons for these conclusions?
Colby, thank you. This is going to generate some controversy, which is fine. Now, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you to ask you some questions, what would be the easiest way to do that?
Yeah, so you can email me at Colby, my first name spelled with a K, So KOLBY.reddish, REDDISH @gmail.com would be a fine way to email me. And I'm more than open to any feedback on the controversy.
Okay, Colby.reddish@gmail.com. Colby, thank you.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking time out from your busy schedule to do this. I appreciate your desire to help appraisers become better. And please let me extend my best to you and your family. It has been an honor. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you so much, Tim, and same to you.
Thank you.